We mourn the loss of the great Charlie Kirk. The Spectator reran an article that Charlie wrote in May. The title was called "A Revolution is Coming to the UK."
Peak woke is, of course, the reaction to another great American death, the death of George Floyd, this fentanyl-soaked addict in that extraordinary summer 2020.
I remember those days really well. Even my two children both called me and begged me not to comment on the George Floyd fentanyl overdose, as Charlie often referred to it.
The great historical question is, was the American Revolution a state founded on new principles or merely a reenactment of those of England? My view is the latter.
This MAGA revolution is coming to the UK. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of David Starkey Talks. I'm Greg Swenson. I'm the chairman of Republicans Overseas, and I'm hoping today to talk about President Trump's visit to the United Kingdom for the great state visit. I'm delighted to join David to discuss the current state of relations of our two great countries as well, and what this visit might mean for the future of the special relationship. And I'm sure we'll talk about Charlie Kirk, of course, today. David, sadly, we mourn the loss of the great Charlie Kirk this weekend. I think that the Spectator reran an article that Charlie wrote in May during his right after his visit to the UK. The title was called "A Revolution is Coming to the UK," and the general premise was, quite often the United Kingdom or Great Britain leads the cultural shift, and then America follows quite often. And the argument a few years ago was very much that England was going woke, becoming more left-leaning, more liberal. You saw the Conservative Party, the so-called Conservative Party, really govern.
Oh, naughty.
Yeah,
Yes.
Essentially governing from the center left, and so I think he has a point, though, that this MAGA revolution, this common sense revolution, is coming to the UK. Do you think that's right?
Yes, I mean, I certainly think that what's happened over the course, I would put it, since 2020, I think the peak woke, peaks, I would call it peak silly, peak left, is, of course, the reaction to another great American death, the death of George Floyd, this fentanyl-soaked addict, who is, of course, a death in a very typical situation with American police, with a notoriously armed and aggressive police force, and equally, of course, bringing to the surface all the accumulated poison of American race relations, going back to the extraordinary compromises that a country which proclaimed itself as being founded on equality, of course, has the most, as it were, logically structured, in the sense of constitutionally entrenched approach to slavery and to racial inequality, and that incredible tension from the beginning there. So I think looking at peak woke in 2020, now peak woke in 2020, of course, is also me. I wasn't Chauvin, but I was, as you know, I was cancelled for refusing to believe that Black Lives Matter was a fundamentally moral movement. I was cancelled because I refused to believe at that point that the slavery was the new genocide. If you remember, there's been this great competition from the left, really ever since the 1960s, to shove aside the Jewish genocide, shove aside the genuine Nazis, and apply, as it were, the good and evil turns from that age to other groups. And one of the silliest attempts, of course, was pretending that slavery was genocide. And if you remember, I was hung, drawn, and quartered, and indeed would have been burned alive if the wretches could have got their hands on me for saying that it wasn't a genocide, and giving the illustration that it wasn't a genocide, because what is it? About 300,000, no more, slaves, black slaves, are sent to the 13 colonies. And I don't know how many blacks you've got in America now. If that's a genocide, how many million? Roughly how many millions? Blacks are what? 10%?
Yeah, no, maybe 13%. So call it 40 million.
40 million. I mean, in other words, just look at the scale. That's not a genocide, whatever else it might have been. So, and if you remember, also in that extraordinary summer where you had mostly peaceful riots, which burned down half the centres of the major cities of America, which here in Britain, at the height of COVID, when any form of public assembly was illegal, there were nevertheless indulged processions, which were so violent we had to board up the statue of Churchill. Churchill's statue is the man who is responsible for the international coalition that defeats Hitler, that defeats Germany, that defeats the Nazis, is daubed racist, and why I think it's peak woke. If you remember, it's also that summer that the notion of the Twitter cancellation central. That was how I was done. In those days, Twitter was politically uniform. It was dominated by the high left. It was dominated by all the groups that Charlie Kirk gave his life to arguing against and to bringing down. And the really interesting example, I think, if you remember, there was a great dispute over the editorials in the New York Times. And you had Barry Weiss, the comment editor, having commissioned a very innocuous article from the right, and every single one of her colleagues saying, this is outrageous, this is shocking, the article being pulled, a note from the editor saying, we made an awful mistake in allowing a possibly slight contrary opinion, and then writing that extraordinary open letter in which she said, this is Barry Weiss, whoever's name appears on the masthead of the editor of the New York Times, the real editor is Twitter. And, we found ourselves in that situation. The left had an instrument. It had an instrument that locked into the new media, and it used it with absolute ruthlessness to hold the whole public sphere. And this is why Trump has to go off and set up Truth Social and whatever. But of course, what happens 2 years later, I always regard it, Greg, as one of the great moments of history involving the kitchen sink. Elon Musk going into Twitter, carrying that kitchen sink. I think, I love the idea of physical objects in history. Being historians, we've got to give a fancy name for them. We call it material culture. But anyway, the 20th century and the whole disruption of good sense begins with another piece of white porcelain. And it begins in New York as well. It begins with Marcel Duchamp, taking in the urinal and proclaiming its art. And then it ends with the return of common sense. And it's very difficult to put the words common sense and Elon Musk together, but we can try. I think that's the beginning of the big sea change. That once you restore, again, Musk very conscious about these things. And also, interestingly, somebody else very conscious of his English ancestry, very, very conscious of the relationship of the Anglosphere to what we used to call the mother country. Musk deliberately saying, I have re-established what he calls the free marketplace of ideas, the centrality, again, with Charlie Kirk, of freedom of speech as the key issue in all of this. Of course, your First Amendment and those extraordinary rulings of the 1960s in your Supreme Court, which entrench it. And I think all of those things are now working themselves out. And what is the position, of course, is that Britain and America are at different stages of the electoral cycle response to that. But I mean, if you go back, and you'll confirm me if my memory is correct, people on this side of the Atlantic tend to think that the free speech absolutism of Elon Musk is the dominant American thread. It's not, is it? I mean, the Democrats. You had Tim Walz in one of the vice presidential debates actually saying he wants to remove First Amendment protections from hate speech. I mean, hate speech is invented in Berkeley. It's invented in the Berkeley Law School. In other words, that America, if Trump had not been elected, you would have had very, very much worse than Keir Starmer.
Yeah, look, I think, as much as there's a lot of criticism of the UK right now on free speech issues, if you go back only 4 and 5 years, you had the Biden campaign colluding with the media companies and the so-called 51 former intelligence officials, and then of course during COVID and the lockdowns and even into 2021 when the White House was colluding with social media to make sure the Great Barrington Declaration couldn't be published, it goes on and on. And I think you're right, David. Peak cancel culture was probably in 2020. I remember those days really well. Even my two children both called me and begged me not to comment on the George Floyd fentanyl overdose, as Charlie often referred to it, and he was right because Charlie was honest. He wasn't afraid to say what was true, and so it of course annoyed the left constantly when he'd refer to the drug overdose of George Floyd, and of course I refused. I think my children were just worried about me, but I did refuse, and I did go on the air, and the most important thing I try to do is not just answer the question, but correct the question.
In other words, the evidence.
Of course.
Both of us are interested in evidence. I mean, in this discussion so far, we haven't just been throwing abstract nouns around. What we've been trying to do is to relate it to specific instances, specific pieces of evidence, behavior of individuals, actual quotations of words. In other words, the proper debate. Now, what I'm interested in, and really very much following on from your question, is what now? I mean, you raised the question about, as it were, America now having gone ahead. I mean, if we're going to use heavily loaded terms, on the path of freedom, and Britain lagging very conspicuously behind. And what I'd like us to talk about now is how that's happened and what America might do about it. Because, of course, you've got a very unusual presidency. I mean, you were talking in your introduction about the special relationship. Actually, for an awful lot of presidents, the special relationship hasn't been remotely special at all. If you look at Obama, he seems positively to have disliked Britain. Biden, of course, despite the fact that his ancestry is half English, is only interested in doing the Irish, and he does the Irish in the very nastiest, and in the Irish Republican, not in your sense of the word, but in again profound hostility to the main British tradition. With Trump, and particularly with JD Vance, we've got something completely different. We've got Trump knowing about his English descent, talking about his grandmother with affection, a deep sense of half my family is Anglo-Scottish and whatever. And even more so, I think, interesting is JD Vance. I mean, am I right, my memory serving me, that he's actually had genetic testing
Just recently, yeah.
which shows that he is 99% English.
Yeah, so as were the founders. They were
Now you see, that's exactly what I'm wanting to get us to. I mean, isn't part of the problem that's gone wrong is that we've forgotten America really is the first daughter of England.
Absolutely.
All the debates of that astonishing constitutional convention and whatever are English gentlemen with the odd English merchant.
Yeah.
They're primarily Virginian gentlemen who've got exactly the same values as somebody from Surrey or whatever. They study the same books, they read the same periodicals, they drink the same staggering quantities of booze.
Yeah, look, the great documents were in many respects, as you said, written by Englishmen, but also based on the great English documents, the Magna Carta and the Bill of
Bill
Rights.
of Rights, particularly the Bill of Rights. Yeah,
And look, I think the pushback started. Yes, it started in America, but I also think wokeism and cancel culture also started in America.
totally.
So maybe there's just a bit of a lag. You're right about the electoral cycle, but I think the way that we win this argument is by persuasion, by making the case, by speaking the truth. And when you started seeing that common sense revolution, it's working. And I started in 2020. I didn't have the influence, of course, that some other people like yourself and the Tucker Carlsons of the world have, or Megyn Kelly. But even just, I mentioned the BBC asking the loaded question of, are the riots in America, y- justified because of the epidemic of unarmed black men being killed by white policemen? Uh, and it's completely absurd.
Of course, it's a total lie. It's a complete lie.
It was just outrageous. So I often quote Heather McDonald from the Manhattan Institute, who's written a lot on this. And at that time of the drug overdose, there had been 1,000 people the prior year killed by police. 23% were black, but blacks commit 53% of the homicides and 63% of the armed robberies. So you're twice as likely to be killed by a policeman in America if you're white. And so, that just freaked them out, of course. I mean, needless to say, I wasn't.
These facts are wonderful.
And that's what Charlie did so well. And needless to say, David, I wasn't called by the BBC for probably a year after that. Same with the Charlottesville hoax. When I corrected CNN on that ended my career as a commentator on CNN. I had a contract with them. Crazy, absolutely crazy. So
Can we just go back to how this is now working out in practice? Because it seems that you were being very kind about what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do what you've been talking about. What I'm using a word I suspect that Charlie would have used himself. I call what I'm doing at the moment evangelizing. I'm trying to get people to understand what's happened to Britain because, of course, that common Anglo-Saxon inheritance that we've been talking about now, which seems to me to be the key thing that made both Britain and America special. I mean, I think the great historical question is: was the American Revolution a state founded on new principles, or merely a reenactment, a relocalization of those of England? My view is the latter. That the whole notion, which some scholars call the great derailment of America, the idea that it's a state founded on the new principle of equality, preposterous. If you actually look at the Constitution, I point out the second clauses of the Constitution immediately begin deciding who is an American. He's got to be born here. It's not just anybody. He's got to be a person in good standing, of a certain age, of a certain degree of property, and then you go on and you work out percentages of blacks and whatever who count towards being human. It's that wonderful second section of the Constitution that throws any notion, is a huge arithmetical overthrow of any simple idea of equality. But you see, what I think has happened, and this is where I think I might need to bring you up to speed. What's happened in Britain since 1997 is we genuinely had a real revolution. I think the American Revolution succeeds because it's not a revolution, it's a rebellion. In other words, the values, the language, the law, the property rights, everything remain the same. It's simply, is America to be ruled by itself, or is it to be ruled by delegated authority from the British Crown? It's no more than that. But from 1997 in Britain, we had a genuine shift, or rather superimposition, of a new political structure, which is essentially a European political structure. We substituted the rule of experts through our quangos, through our quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, of which, of course, all the things that Elon Musk was attacking, the various, what you call them, the federal, what do you call them?
the unelected bureaucracy.
The unelected bureaucracy, the Washington bureaucracy, the swamp, very, very similar. We have 444 plus of these things, controlling nearly a third of state expenditure with no democratic impulse. So Blair sent enormous amounts of power into the permanent bureaucracy. And then on the other hand, exaggerating America right from the beginning with the setting up of the Supreme Court and that great coup by the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court that effectively turns the Supreme Court into the final resolving agency of your Constitution. Blair then also imports something like that into Britain, and again, it's so interesting how debates on either side of the Atlantic echo each other. If you remember Corny Barrett, when she slapped down the Democrat DI hire on the Supreme Court and said, you're arguing against an imperial presidency and you want to replace it with an imperial judiciary. Well, that's exactly what Blair did in England. And the result is we've now got, and I'd like to put this to you, there are actually two different understandings of democracy on either side of the Atlantic. You have still got, just thanks to Trump's victory, thanks to the Republican victory, you've still got the old idea that democracy has something to do with the rule of the majority, of putting the interests, MAGA, putting the interests of the state first. On this side of the Atlantic, the way was led by Germany, and the reaction to the alleged role of the German people in spawning the horrors of Hitler. Germany beginning the way, there has been a profound mistrust of democracy. And instead, we've invented this thing called liberal democracy, which isn't the rule of the majority. It's the protection of minorities against the majority through the machinery of law. And it seems to me what we're now seeing, you saw it most clearly when Vance came over a few months ago, and you had that great confrontation in Munich. And if you remember, he told Europe, we've got to put freedom of speech, whereupon the German chairman of the meeting broke down in tears. Can you imagine a middle-aged diplomat?
I know.
I mean, again, exactly the sort of thing Charlie was doing. Challenged in debate, has got no answer, but dissolves in tears. And I'm not sure that this is fully understood in America. And I think it's really, I'm sure it's not fully understood here, that there are now two completely different views. One is that the power of democracy has got to be bridled as much as possible by non-democratic or even anti-democratic institutions, and the other is, which one's seeing seeing with MAGA and Trump, that finally the will of the people, the people, have to be given. They are the final source of authority. Their will finally has to be respected.
Oh, absolutely. And we were running down a really slippery slope, with the Obama years and the Biden years. And you saw the legislation from the bench. And that's not the way it's supposed to work, right? You should legislate from Congress. Those are elected by the people.
Again, the whole issue of abortion. I mean, everybody's saying the Supreme Court declared it illegal. It didn't.
No.
It should go back to the states.
Right, exactly. And that I still hear that term, but Trump's a misogynist because he outlawed abortion. Well, no, that doesn't make you a misogynist, even if he could outlaw abortion, which he can't. And so it's just completely absurd when you hear that rhetoric. And again, going back to Charlie, he just told the truth. I was on Al Jazeera yesterday, and they referred to Charlie Kirk as someone who, made racist comments and homophobic comments. Not true, first of all, but also that he was against reproductive rights. And I wish he was alive to argue with that. But
yeah, I was going to say, isn't it extraordinary that the triumph of feminism is to define reproductive right as the absolute right of a woman to abort a fetus? Now, I am not a Christian. I have very different views on the subject, but the sheer logical absurdity, the complete self-destructive preposterousness of this. But what I'm now puzzled by, you've been so clear on this, your chair of Republicans abroad and whatever. Why, apparently, is Trump flirting with the dreadful Keir Starmer? Why does Trump say this is a good man? Why on earth is JD Vance as intelligent, as clever, a decent look, a fine writer? Why on earth is he consorting with our fool of a former foreign secretary? Now you know that one of the things that I think is most terrible. This man is now Lord Chancellor, and wears the same robes as St. Thomas More. I mean, the decline. I thought when David Lammy sat in Palmerston's desk, this was the final. U.S. Foreign Secretary. This was the final indicator of the collapse of Britain. But when this man wears the robes of a Lord Chancellor, and you can see behind him Wolsey, you can see behind him Thomas More weeping, weeping. But what's going on? Is it just that in order to make the special relationship work, you've got to pretend to like people that you don't like?
I think that's part of it, David. And look, I think they're not afraid to criticize, Keir Starmer. So they, on one hand, they're friendly because they respect the special relationship. There's a brotherhood between the two countries that, even when Obama and Biden were presidents, they were obnoxious. They didn't respect Churchill, taking the bust out of the White House or the Oval Office, so they were hostile to Britain, back of the queue comment from Obama, for example, and you had many of those comments from Biden, but the people still respect each other. There's a bond between the people of the two countries, and so, and contrary to the critics on the left and in the media, President Trump can be diplomatic, right? It's just called diplomacy. You have to keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and so I do think that there's a respect out of respect for the country, and but I think they're quite aware of the flaws of Starmer and Lammy and the rest of the lot, and they're not afraid to make those criticisms. And you saw that in the press conference in Turnberry when I think in many ways, I don't know if he did it on purpose, but he almost humiliated Keir Starmer. I mean, hosting him at his big mansion.
Oh, it was hilarious. It was one. We all said it looked like a Roman emperor receiving, the odd provincial tribal leader. As they hesitantly climbed the steps before him. And of
It
course,
was
the fact that Trump is so enormously tall and Keir Starmer's a little man like me, of course, made the whole thing even more gloriously absurd. But I mean, now being very serious, of course, all of these issues, in one sense, they're high political theory. What does freedom of speech actually mean? How absolutist is it? What has been the role of the state in deliberately suppressing it, as opposed to letting individual favored groups like the transgendered or whatever do it? I mean, you referred to one aspect of all of this with the role during COVID of our governments on both sides of the Atlantic employing the whole machinery of the social media and political management to silence dissent very deliberately to limit freedom of speech. But of course, all of these issues now really focus, don't they, on sharp commercial interests. They focus sharply on the role of the main vehicles. I mean, particularly with what's been done with Twitter by Elon Musk. The issues now focus on the role of the big American online companies, the social media and whatever, and how far they are amenable to the kind of speech control legislation, which the European Union and Britain is trying to impose. I mean, presumably, this will simply be resisted absolutely in America. Am I right on that?
Without a doubt. It's just that it can't be tolerated. I mean, the Constitution doesn't exist or survive without the First Amendment and, frankly, the Second Amendment, but that's a different issue. But I do think that there is major pushback that will not be tolerated. JD Vance, kind of led the charge in Munich. But remember, back to our prior topic about the relationship, he also, referred to Great Britain as our friends. And I think it's this sibling relationship where when you see one of your siblings make a mistake or veer
Oh,
down the
it's not
wrong path.
sibling. Come on, we're not siblings. We are the same relationship, roughly, as you and me in terms of age, doddering age on this side of the Atlantic.
No,
and slightly decaying middle age on that side. There's an anteriority
You could
of
say
yeah,
big brother, little brother, or,
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
and there is some of that element. There's no doubt about it. And I do think because of their fondness for the UK, both the president and the vice president want what's best for the UK, and I think it will work. I think the revolution is coming. It couldn't come soon enough, as you know. But I don't say that from a position of sort of snobbery, because we had it the same thing in the United States. I mean, it
Or,
was a
as you said,
really
all of these things, they all began in America, but of course they derive ultimately from bad French philosophy. As I say, all bad ideas are French, and then they get refracted through American money, American academic institutions, and the poison of American race relations. But I mean, just thinking about it, I mean, here we do have a very different situation in that the grip of that Biden-esque or Obama-esque world has not been broken. That, on the contrary, in the Starmer government is the equivalent of all the bad features of Biden and Obama fused together. And they, of course, have to use the ability to silence people
oh yeah,
to
yeah.
stop that revolution. The people doing the silencing here essentially are the agencies of the state and of the police, which is why there's the Lucy Connolly case and so on. And now that, I think, does present something very different. And I think this means, I'm going to put a case to you. On this side of the Atlantic, we are in a position where all the things that Charlie was talking about are really entrenched state policy. The things that he criticizes, critical race theory, absolute belief in multiculturalism, belief in international liberalism, the importance of immigration, the absence of borders, all these things are in more or less specifically actual state policy. And it's the policy of law. The reason that woke is so powerful is that it's entrenched in law. Now, the area where the law is being challenged most is on Twitter, because for the obvious reason that Musk deliberately opened it up. Now, there's a very interesting series of discussions going on here, as visibly our government is losing control. I mean, you will have been following the events of the last week or two, also centering on America, with the marvelous case of the disgraced ambassador, the Prince of Darkness, now suddenly thrust down into the pit of hell, where many people would say, I'm quite friendly with him, by the way, where many people, very charming and dangerous, where many people would actually say he belongs. But people are now openly speculating here that as the government starts to lose control, as that of ideas, of the sphere, in other words, exactly what happens in the run up to your revolution, when the dominant power begins to lose control of the public discourse, that the first and obvious thing that the British government will try to do is ban Twitter.
Oh yeah.
Now, what do you think the American reaction would be?
Well, obviously, they would be outraged. Now, of course, the progressive radical left would probably be thrilled with it.
Precisely.
And remember, as you know, the Democrats and the liberals used to be the champions of free speech. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU. And it's amazing how it's flipped. They've gone from the
Totally.
anti-war party and the free speech party to the pro-war anti-speech party. It's phenomenal what's happened. I mean, or incredible. And so I think generally there would be major pushback from the US. And again, it's because we had a taste of this only 4 or 5 years ago.
Exactly. I mean, just picking that point up, because again, this wonderful sense of the echo chamber of the Atlantic. Here we had a woman. We had exactly our own version of the Civil Liberties Union, headed by now a Labour PRS, Shami Chakrabarti, passionate advocate of freedom of speech. Suddenly now is the one saying, "Oh, race relations, community relations, whatever, have to take priority. Oh, DEI has to take priority." The astonishing somersault And so we again, things like amnesty are on the side now of repression. There's been complete inversion of the left, all of which makes next week's state visit even more interesting than state visits tend to be, doesn't it?
I think so.
Have you got any sense as to what Trump and Vance actually want from it? Is it just cuddly ceremony? Is the thought, and it is a very nice thought when you're in Windsor, you are in where the president will be received, you're in the largest in, Mr. Trump is very fond of big things, and he's in the biggest inhabited castle in the world. The major structure of it by the king who straddled the Western Europe in the 14th century, Edward III. The shells built by Edward III. The rooms inside are transformed at the time of Britain's triumph with Nelson and Wellington. The centre is the Waterloo Chamber with the wonderful paintings primarily by Lawrence, of all the European leaders who were assembled under Britain's leadership against Napoleon. And then the heart, where the state banquet will take place, is St. George's Hall, the great hall of the Garter, the oldest order of chivalry, and the premier order of chivalry in Europe. So all of that is absolutely spectacular. And the suites that he will be occupying on the south side, I think he will be put on the south side, in the rooms that are built for the very beginning of intermonarchical diplomacy, when transport becomes easier at the end of the 19th century. So he'll be staying, we were talking about Germany, he'll be almost certainly staying in the rooms that were occupied by the German Kaiser or the Russian Tsar before the First World War. How do you think he? I mean, obviously he's really going to enjoy that.
He'll love it, and really fascinating description of Windsor. I've never been, and I'm looking. I'm don't know that I'll be inside of the castle this week, but sure, we're having a dinner on Tuesday night nearby at the Guildhall.
Oh, that's spectacular. Where of course the king and queen were married.
Yes, that's right.
I better correct myself. Went through their civil ceremony.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to join us, please, by the way. No, so I think that the president, of course, he loves this stuff, right? This is a chance for him to be on this great stage, and there's no better place to do this kind of, ceremonial stuff than in Great Britain, obviously. And so, I think he'll love it, and so will the vice president. But I do think there'll be some either little digs, little side knocks about the UK, because they care about the UK, but they see what's going on here, and I would actually think with JD Vance probably more so, and I think you'll see that. I look for the interview with Bev Turner on GB News. I think that will be an eye an eye opener, because I don't think Bev is going to be shy about talking about free speech and other ills in British society. So she's flying on Air Force. I assume she's flying on Air Force One. She did for the Scotland trip, and of course the president called on her on every occasion. So I think that will be an eye opener, and I bet 10 Downing Street is really nervous about that one.
Because, of course, that, in one sense, that's an extraordinarily, bearing in mind the role of GB News, that's an extraordinarily partisan intervention, as it is the most politicized of our TV stations, and the one, of course, most firmly aligned with the kind of things we're talking about. But we have left, of course, unnamed King Charles. And I think that with all his good manners, it would be difficult to think of a host and a guest who are further apart, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, the king will be tested to sort of remain divorced from his prior life. Because when he was Prince Charles, he was obviously a net zero or, climate.
Still is. Still
Yeah.
is.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, he just doesn't talk about it as much. So it must really annoy the king that the president and the vice president are so articulate, but also so powerful in shutting down that whole scam in America. And remember, Biden, these things started on the academic left, and the universities were basically taken over by the radical left over the last two generations. but then it oozed into government and they made it policy, or at least Biden did. So, he said this is a whole of government emphasis on DEI.
Exactly. So, again, what is so fascinating, it's exactly the same here. Bizarrely, of course, if you're looking at climate change, the worst instance is a supposed conservative, Theresa May. He is the
Yes.
one who actually, after about 5 minutes debate in Parliament, legislates net zero by 2050, which means in Britain, finally, because it's entrenched in law, the target of net zero is entrenched in law, judges determine extractive policy. And it is completely
It's insane.
completely insane. Now, but going back, sorry, I'm going to continue pressing on this. What I found so interesting with Trump, and why I think he is so staggeringly effective as a president, and why also some of the attack on him has picked on exactly the same thing. One of the placards I saw being waved around in the various protests that have been against him is "No King Here."
Yeah.
That great feature of the choices of the American Revolution, when we won't have a king, which nearly happened in Britain itself in the civil wars of the 17th century. But it's clear, isn't it, that Trump is one of the most naturally monarchical of presidents. I mean, I think this is the affinity with King Charles. I remember that moment when when Trump was enthroned and Starmer was sort of crouching down there, proffering up like the humble messenger the letter from King Charles, which is then opened. And the first thing, do you remember the first thing that Trump pointed at?
His signature, I believe.
That's right. Charles is huge. Charles R. And you look at Trump's signature, it's another one of these great flamboyant, we will, that royal will. And in Britain, in theory, it's still the royal will. That the endorsing clause for an act of parliament is le roi le veut. The king wants it, the royal will. And I think what you've seen with Trump, and why I think he's so staggeringly effective as a politician, is if you look at the figures on this side of the Atlantic, like Keir Starmer, they have vastly greater theoretical powers than Trump. The British Prime Minister, if he can control Parliament, can literally do whatever he wants, that you actually make and unmake the law. But Trump has done something which, and yet, despite all of those powers, Starmer appears preposterous, hamstrung, incapable of doing anything. I would argue because of the dense network of laws and conventions which the Blairite revolution created. But what you see with Trump is this ability. That moment when he assumed the presidency, sworn in the rotunda, goes to the Resolute desk, which of course is a present from Victoria. I mean, that sense of literally the handover of empire, even at the height of the British Empire, is so powerful there. And you've got Stephen Miller behind him with that great pile of executive orders, and then that flamboyant signature, the orders held up to the camera, the pens flung into the audience, and things happened. Things actually changed. And this is you look at France at the moment. No politician can do anything.
They're frozen.
We're frozen in this kind of stasis. And what I think is most fascinating with Trump, he's broken the permafrost.
Yeah.
Things are now good things, bad things, but at least there's a sense that politics can actually do something.
Yeah, it's been remarkable. I mean, I didn't expect this kind of scale and this kind of pace. And he's the executive, and remember, he's a founder. He was a founder of this empire, this business empire that's different from being a manager or a technocrat. Like a Mitt Romney who just climbed his way up. That's quite successfully, but climbed his way up the private equity ladder. But Trump is a founder, and he acts like one. And that's why I think executives should be either governors or business leaders, the chief executive. So he's a man of action. I mean, it's phenomenal
But
to
he's a
see.
very unusual. Sorry, you see, I think you made a very interesting point there. Most business leaders now are simply a particular kind of bureaucrat.
Right.
In the great companies operate as bureaucracies in the same way the state operates as a bureaucracy. The peculiarity of Musk, the peculiarity of Musk, I would also argue Musk falls at least into the same category as Trump, and that Trump is, I suppose, most simply one could put it, an entrepreneur. But he's done it, hasn't he, by essentially theatrical methods.
Yeah.
Monarchy is also about theatre. Shakespeare is constantly going on about politics as the stage, in the sense of both the performing stage and also the scaffold on which you lose your head if things go wrong and you get impeached and otherwise done up at the end of it. But Trump, that extraordinary way in which Trump, everything to do with Trump had his name on it.
Yeah. And you look at that, it's a great point. I mean, he's a brand in many ways, but he's also, as I said, a man of action. And I'm fascinated with the way he's been so transparent, right? He's so part of it's theater, and he uses the theater, makes everything a big announcement. Everything's grand because he's selling to the people. You still need the support. He is not a king. He can't just dictate, right? And contrary to what his critics and the media will say about him, but he needs to sell it to the people. Look at his cabinet. Half the cabinet's former Fox News broadcasters. They're all attractive and they're all really well prepared at articulating the message.
But you have one ultra serious person, Scott Bessent.
Yes.
You've got keeping that whole show on the road is one of the shrewdest, most level-headed, most ruthless, with all the charm, the elegant gay man routine. I am really so suave and smooth. Brutal operators on Wall Street. And I think, again, the extraordinary contrast. I mean, America is as bankrupt as Britain, if you actually look at the state of your public finance.
Absolutely.
But you've got somebody managing them who understands the market. Here we have got useless financial bureaucrats doing it, and I think that, I mean, I've found the role of somebody like that, the role of somebody so transparently intelligent and so aware of the reality of financial markets, of so clever at manipulating them. He's using the same devices that he did when he was he was a poacher. He was running private equity and whatever, and he's now using those same techniques. Now he's gamekeeper, which is a way that no other central bank is doing. I mean, obviously he's in terms of sale of federal debt and whatever, he's going round the edge of the Federal Reserve, but doing it in astonishing. And I think we need to look at that extent. And I mean, I would guess, maybe people who know my American history better than I do, I think Bessent looks to me to be of the same sort of caliber as an Alexander Hamilton. And if you look at that extraordinary setup of people, the founding fathers, the role of Hamilton, as opposed to the crazy rural idealists like Jefferson, that hard-nosed, brilliant sense of the market, the importance of trade, the importance of money, and so on. Absolutely central.
I'm glad you brought up Scott Bessent, who's a really good friend of mine. I saw him last week, and it's funny you mentioned Hamilton. We were in his office, and he had this grand picture of Alexander Hamilton. He really appreciates the history and appreciates Hamilton himself, and so it's fascinating to see him work. And you're right, he's probably the only non-Fox News person there, but he's getting better at it. He's doing media all the time. So even though he doesn't have the media background, like a Pete Hegseth or Judge Janine or whomever, he's getting the hang of it. I mean, he's on TV it must be 3 or 4 times a day. It's amazing. So because that's the whole idea. They're transparent, most transparent White House we've ever had, and they're doing everything in real time.
And they won't shut up, will they? I mean, Biden was a bit like the oracle at Delphi. It spoke once every 6 months. Whereas Trump will not shut up.
President Autopen, yeah, it must be driving the left crazy because it's just every day there's just more news. And when he took a weekend off and played some golf, they freaked out. Of course,
They
started
thought he
rumors that
died.
yeah, well, no, they wanted him to die, but that's obvious. But they they started this rumor mill that he was sick or that he was. I mean, it's completely heartless.
What you've been talking about there, what you call transparency, is it a new way of trying to do a kind of town hall democracy? In other words, are we using the new media and the old media too, effectively to turn a country of how many tens of hundreds of millions you are? What is it, 400 and odd million you are?
350, 350, 360.
Yeah, you're pushing.
Plus the illegal migrants, so it's probably 400, all of whom will be counted in the census, by the way, in 2030.
Absolutely, absolutely. What you're doing isn't it? Trump is really trying to reconstitute something like a form of deliberative democracy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, again, the role of, okay, Trump not king, but certainly as prince. If you look at the great leaders, the way Shakespeare represents the great leaders, they are always people who are ruled both by action and by speech. The extraordinary, the extraordinary figures like a Henry V or whatever in Shakespeare, that ability, because you said kings just order. Actually, all great kings persuaded. All great kings did exactly what we are talking about now. They had the art of taking people with them rather than compelling obedience. They won it willingly, which gave them both a personal power as well as a constitutional power. And I wonder, with all the gloom that we have about the fact that the electronic age is going to make traditional views of democracy and traditional views of the state impossible, I'm wondering whether in this extraordinary chaotic way that America so often does, we're actually seeing something optimistic.
Oh, without a doubt.
And for me as a historian, again, Burkean, it is the extraordinary notion that those ideas that history isn't a dead ground, that it's not a corset or a straitjacket or manacles, but it's actually the source of constant renewal. In other words, what we're seeing now, are we? Maybe we're both getting old and bleary-eyed and need our cataracts sorting out, but are we actually seeing something like the vision of the founders reinvented for the new age?
I think so. It's happening in America. I hope it happens here, and I think it can happen here. Maybe I'm just a shameless optimist, but things were pretty bad in America, and the president just articulates in a very simple way. He doesn't have the oratory skills of an Obama or even Reagan, and yet he just says it like he tells the truth. He just kind of states the obvious.
Now, come. Don't let. I think the truth and President Trump is a shifting relationship. I mean, let's.
Well, he exaggerates, right?
Come on, let's not.
He
be
likes
too far.
hyperbole. He likes hyperbole, but
Yes, yeah.
look at what he's doing. I mean, he's stating the obvious, right? Okay, men should not play in women's sports. What is so crazy about that? That's not radical. That's Charlie Kirk would say the same thing, and they called him far right. It's an extremist because the extremist doesn't want a 6 foot man playing against their 5'6" daughter. Yeah, they've lost their minds, and so the same thing with net zero. Day one, shut it down, try to get some of that money back that was squandered by the Biden administration, and let's just use common sense, right? We're the biggest oil producer in the world. Let's pump some more. Let's get oil prices down. Let's regenerate the economy. I mean,
the gap on this issue between Britain and America is absolute. We have we have power prices here, electricity prices 4 times why industry is dying here. I suspect, much of the dispute over pharmaceuticals, which is going on now, all sophisticated modern industry depends on access to cheap fuel. That was the power driver of the American. That was the power driver of the Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. Greg, I've enormously enjoyed talking to you. We must continue the conversation.
Yeah,
We will all watch events in Windsor, either there or online or on TV
yeah.
next week, with great interest. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, David. Been a great time.
A real pleasure. Thank you.